Welcome to Life Lessons, number 44. And we're starting now a new book from the 5 books of Moses, the 5th one, known as parshat Chumash Devarim, the book of Devarim, known as Deuteronomy. This is the one where Moses, repeats everything over to all the children of Israel. Till now, he has received everything directly from God, and now he becomes like a messenger of God by repeating everything. So there's a difference between the dictation from the first 4 and this last one. The first 4, he was like almost God is telling him and he is dictating. Now he's repeating what he heard from God. So it's explained like the Shekhinah, the presence of God, is speaking from his mouth. But who's speaking? It's Moshe speaking, and he's repeating what he has heard from God. So it's a review. We find some new things too, but in generally speaking, he goes over with them everything that happened in the last 40 years. It's a sum up till we come to the end of the book is where Moshe passes away. So it's known Devarim. In English, literally means words. These are the words. These are the words that Moshe spoke. But before we get into it, start a little bit with a story. So they say as follows. There was a little town, a small town, and there were 2 boys in that town, a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And they were very wild. They were very wild. So anything that went wrong in town, something broke, the blame was on these 2 boys. And like this is how it went on. The parents, especially the mother, was having a very hard time with it. Anything that went wrong, hey, your boys. One day she heard that there's a rabbi that came to town. So she figured she'll send the boys to the rabbi, that the rabbi should talk to them. So she tells the 10-year-old, why don't you take your younger brother, the 8-year-old, go where the rabbi is staying and just tell him that my mother sent you that you should talk to them, to talk to us. Okay. They arrived. The rabbi sits them down, and you have the older one, the younger one, they're sitting by a desk in front of him, and the rabbi is trying his magic. So with a stern voice, he turns to the younger one and he says, tell me, where is God? The little kid starts to shiver. And the rabbi doesn't let go. He says, where is God? And he kept on repeating it. The little kid, the 8-year-old, started to cry, shivering, and then he picked himself up and ran away. The older boy ran after him. He ran back to the house and he hid in the closet. The boy comes and tells him, tell me, what's going on? Why are you crying? What happened? What did you run away? He says, didn't you hear? God is missing and they're blaming us. So Moses is informing the Jewish people here that God is not missing. He is involved in our lives. And sometimes we think that maybe he's missing. And maybe we should take the blame for it. So here we are in this portion here. And what's interesting is there's an interesting contrast with what was finished off in last segment 43. The verse spoke about the same place where they are, where they're positioned. We talk about the 42 journeys, And finally they came to the last journey. So it says, where were they? So it says as follows. And they camped by the Jordan, where? Be'arvot Moab, on the banks, on the plains of Moab. This is where they are. When we start our first verse here in Parashat Devarim, it says, these are the words of rebuke which Moshe spoke, told the Jewish people in the plains of Moab, but where? The bank of Jordan. Be'ever hayarden. The emphasis is on the bank of Jordan. Here's very interesting. When you give somebody a location, you could sometimes say, where is it next to? Is it next to what's before it? Or is it next to what's ahead of it? So where they are now, are they by the plains of Moab, from where they're coming from? Or we are by the river where we're about to cross? And the question will be asked, what's the difference? So if we think about it, there's a very difference. The big difference is, am I looking forward or am I looking backwards? What's in our heads? From where we coming from or where am I going to? So you could look, we had such a difficult 40 years in the desert and maybe getting lost. Where am I now? By the banks of Moab, on the plains of Moab. Or I'm looking forward to the final destination, crossing the Jordan. So therefore now, when we're starting this new book, it is with the optimism that Moshe is going to now talk to them. Even though he's going to go over with them on certain things that not necessarily was so great, but the point of that is to help them out in the march forward in the optimistic view as they're crossing the land of Israel, as they're coming into the land of Israel. So this is what happens in this parasha. And as we go on, it's all a review, but with the idea is to help them for how they're going to settle in Israel. I want to bring out an interesting verse that is mentioned over here in this parasha. One of those are familiar with the word Shema. Shema means listen. There is expressions in the Torah where sometimes it's called when you see something, and sometimes it's when you're listening, when you hear. Shema Yisrael, hear Israel. Or we say, Re'eh, see. Seeing and hearing is two separate ideas. When you hear something, it could be from a distance. You hear, that means to say, I understand. You didn't see the thing. When you see something, means it's so clear that there's no questions about it whatsoever. I know sometimes in English, even when you hear something, a person would say, oh, I see. I see. What's the idea of I see? I understand. So seeing confirms something and makes something much stronger. Now, the Israelites are going to cross now into Israel. And it's going to be a very big change. The change is going to be in leadership. they were with Moses, and now, at this point it's not there, but this is what's going to happen. When they're going to be ready to cross, it's going to be Joshua. He's going to take over. So it's interesting, there's a verse here that says, Ve'ata Shema Yisrael. And now, hear, listen, Israel. When Moses was talking to his generation, those that came out of Egypt, the expression was, haven't you seen all the miracles? When he's talking now to the generations that's going into Israel, that's the second generation, the language changes. Haven't you heard? And the difference, simply speaking, is very interesting because quite a few of them were born in the desert. They were not there when they came out of Egypt. They didn't witness with their own eyes all the miracles. It's what they heard from their parents. As we know for ourselves many times, certain things that we heard from the previous generations, stories, what our parents told us, what they went through, the war, and other things like this, we were not there. So we were listening. We listening to what they're saying. And even when we were going to repeat to somebody else, it's not going to be with the same fervor as they said it because they lived it through. They saw it. We hear, we read the news, we heard about it. So here's something very interesting. When we talk about in the goal of serving God, the ultimate goal is to see. So it's not just that we heard, that we should be able to see it. But we know where does it start. You can't jump to seeing because obviously we are not the previous generation. And let's put it, if we're talking about a relationship with God, the world conceals the presence of God. God is not in a revealed way. We need to work on ourselves in our relationship with God till we could say such a thing, I see. So it's a situation of hearing and listening. Moshe, the great leader Moshe, was his presence amongst the Jewish people was as seeing. If there was a problem, he could bring it to God and bring back the answer. So the relationship is like a relationship of seeing. Joshua, the student of Moshe, known as Yoshua, the relationship there will be like listening. They're going to try to remember everything that Moses had taught them to be able to give it over to the next generation. There's even a story in the Talmud that they forgot certain of the things. Not everything got written down. So it says they had to remember and other people remember, but there was a certain point there that some of the laws were forgotten. So in other words, not everything, as we would say, has registered right away. So sometimes when you have Moshe, the presence of Moshe is powerful enough. And this is interesting to understand this in our day-by-day lives, how we look on things. Everything has an advantage and a disadvantage. So even when we talk about seeing and hearing, but each one of them has an advantage and a disadvantage. The obvious is that seeing has an advantage when things are so clear, and listening has a disadvantage because it's a little bit from a distance. But then they tell us that when you see something, the only reason why it's so clear to you is because you saw it. So not necessarily you were able to understand it completely. So a lot of times And it's interesting how in Jewish law it comes out. It says a judge, or I'll put it the other way, it says a witness should not become the judge in a case. Because the minute you saw it, you have another opinion about what you saw, and therefore you can't judge anymore. And this is very interesting. I would almost argue if you saw it, who could be more of a judge? You saw, you know all the details. No, we say no, because in what you saw, therefore, the circumstances and what's around it, those things don't register. So only what you saw. And therefore, you formed an opinion based on what you saw. And therefore, it could complicate sometimes about what was behind the scene that you didn't see. And that only a judge that hears. So advantage of hearing is that when you understand the subject, it is clear. It's immovable. So sometimes the idea of a distance is where you could reach to areas where before you couldn't. Let's take, for example, when somebody says, I could only behave properly if everyone around me behaves properly. So I need to live in a neighborhood that everyone behaves. So let's say if I live in a neighborhood that people go to houses of worship, then I'll follow, I'll also go. But if I live in a neighborhood that people don't go, I'm not going to have the guts to go and do something that the rest don't do. So some individuals become right away influenced by the surrounding around them. So the only way they would work if they see all the time. They can't work in a situation if they need to hear. It doesn't work. So all the time, constantly, they need to be reminded. We know for ourselves in education that some children need constantly a reminder. And we could hear many times parents that will complain and say, didn't I tell you yesterday? Didn't I tell you the same thing before yesterday? Yes. But constantly they need to see the situation. They can't function if they from a distance and to remember. As we know, another example, a teacher that becomes too friendly to his students, we know that's not going to be so successful. There has to be that distance over there for a certain respect. So the child, as the child matures, what happens? And that's what it's supposed to be. Whatever they were able to see from their parents will help them now when they can't see their parents, when they find themselves in a distance. So the seeing helped them. So there was a certain point in their life where they have to be in a situation of seeing, reminded all the time. But then comes a point where the individual, the kid, the child starts to mature, and then slowly on their own is enough what they have from their parents, the hearing, the listening, to help them out. That's exactly what happened here with transformation from Moses to Joshua. Moses was clearly the man of God. Wherever you look in the Torah, he's described Ish HaElokim, the man of God. No question about this. Who in our history that we have went up, was there for 40 days, 40 nights in heaven, didn't eat, didn't drink, almost like an angel, comes back down. No other prophet in our history, Jewish history, that we have such a thing that was like Moses. Moses was the only one. From Moses to Moses, there was no other one. He was the only type, that kind of a prophet. They tell us, the Maimonides tell us, all the other prophets How did God appear to them? In a dream. They had a vision. They had a vision. And from the vision, from the dream, whatever, they heard something, and then it became confirmed. Moshe Rabbeinu was able, so to say, speak face to face, like a friend speaking to another friend. There isn't such a thing. So when Moses comes down and he tells them, this is what God said, there's no questions whatsoever that this is what God said. Later on, the prophets say something, you will see some people questioning. Did he get it right? Maybe he heard it wrong. You know, there's a joke that they say about Moshe. So because Moshe Rabbeinu was stuttering. And the only time he didn't stutter when he gave over the words of God, the words of God. So when Moshe would say something, so they say that a lot of the things that Moses had said, that's what they want to say, because he stuttered, so it didn't come out right, and that's why it was a little bit misconstrued what he said. But as we know, it's not true. When Moshe Rabbeinu gave over something, it was representing what God wanted. Anyways, that is back the difference between Moses and Yoshua. But Joshua has an advantage also. The advantage of the listening to is that if the person does understand, he'll be able to perform when even it's hard, when there is challenges. If you find yourself in a situation where always everything is wonderful, you got Moses in front of you the whole time, that's it. I've got a question, I'm going to ask him, finished. It's like almost where not necessarily you had to exercise your emotions, your intellect. You don't have to do anything, just do, because you're part of the crowd and everyone is so excited, you're seeing and everything is wonderful. Mount Sinai, a revelation from God of Mount Sinai. What could be more than that? And some of us would want to live that way for the rest of life. Like almost every day is a party. But you have to get up in the morning and go to work. And that's where the idea is of listening. That even where you find yourself in a place that where maybe God is not revealed, God is concealed, you should be able to hear. And that's what he's saying to the Am Yisrael, to the Jewish people in this section. And now listen, Israel. Not just see, listen, because it's a whole different story. It brings out a very interesting point. One of the Hasidic rabbis, we mentioned it I think a few times, known as the Katzker, he used to ask the famous question that everyone asks, where is God? So everyone says, what do you mean, where is God? He's all over the place. What do you mean, where is God? Up, down. So he would say, you know where is God? Wherever you let him in. Where is God? Where you let him in. So that's another level, no question. In a deep, God is all over. But then when we talk about in the individual relationship, where is he? Where you let him in. You have a house. Is it a place where God could come in? Could God feel comfortable in that house? Or you say, you hear a knock on the door, and there's a voice, and God says, can I come in to visit? No, not today, not today. Tomorrow. I'm not ready for your visit. So the idea is that all the time, that even when we find ourselves in a situation where it's not revealed, in our day-by-day life, we could divide many things. We could say when I find myself in synagogue and I'm praying to God, this is like the level of seeing. But when I'm not in synagogue, I'm a place at work, or other kinds of things, materialistic things, then you are in a situation of listening. God is in a distance. And that's where it comes in. The very important point is that even when I find myself in the banks of Moab, I am looking forward to cross into Israel, to cross into the promised land. And that is the important lesson that we have from this parasha. Will become something very interesting. That always this parasha is read right before when we mourn on the destruction of the temple. Because that is the answer. That when we look on such a thing, destruction of the temple, we don't get lost on the tragedy itself, but we look, how could we rebuild it? And the only way we could rebuild it was that optimism that Moshe was teaching us all the time. And therefore, this parasha Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu repeats everything, but in a deeper point of all that is, he's trying to tell us, because many times, this is interesting, many times we could praise a person, elevate the person, and not to mention anything about the discomfort. We'll ignore it completely. But many times it goes with both things together. At the same time Moshe Rabbeinu is praising them, he's also reminding them some of the discomfort for the point of view of listening. When you're seeing these little things, who cares? It'll fall on the side. But when you're in a process of listening, every detail becomes important, and every detail is very helpful to the ultimate journey, the crossing to the promised land very soon.